Every set of eyes in the room looked down on him, certain he was nothing, certain he had no place among them, until he proved them wrong in a way none could deny. From that moment on, nothing would be the same, because his gift was larger than the room, larger than the prejudice, larger even than the machine he touched. This is a story of rebirth hidden in plain sight, waiting for its twist to be revealed. Like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what you think of the plot and where you're watching from. The hangar was suffocating under the weight of failure, every man in the circle of engineers worn out by hours of fruitless labor. They had opened panels, swapped out parts, run diagnostic after diagnostic, and still the sleek Gulfstream engine mocked them with its stubborn silence. Richard Caldwell's crisp navy suit looked sharper than the tools scattered across the floor, and his polished shoes tapped against the concrete with impatience. The white billionaire had built his reputation on punctuality and control, but here, in this cavernous space filled with sweat and frustration, he was powerless to move forward. His multi-million-dollar deal in New York was slipping away by the minute, and the faces of his hand-picked team carried the same defeat he refused to voice. Then came the interruption, sharp and unexpected from the doorway. A black boy, maybe 19 or 20, thin from missed meals, clothes torn and sneakers battered, stood there with a calm that didn't match his appearance. "If you permit, I will fix it." The laughter that followed was quick, mocking, and full of disbelief. One engineer smirked openly, nudging his colleague, while another shook his head with exaggerated disdain. The boy's skin color, his ragged clothing, and his audacity combined to make him the perfect target for their scorn. "Who let him in here?" someone muttered, half amused, half irritated. The two security guards moved forward automatically, their boots echoing, ready to drag him out into the hot Atlanta sun. But the boy did not step back. His eyes were fixed not on the guards, not even on the engineers, but on the massive engine in the center of the hangar. His stare was steady, almost reverent, as though he and the machine were speaking a language no one else could hear. His hands trembled slightly at his sides, but his voice, when he repeated himself, was firmer. "I know what's wrong with it." Richard Caldwell's voice sliced through the mocking chorus. "Stop." The guards froze. The engineers fell silent. Caldwell's sharp gaze moved from the silent engine to the ragged boy, his expression unreadable. He had built an empire on instinct, on seizing unlikely opportunities, and though this moment bordered on absurd, something in the boy's unwavering stare pulled at him. "Let him speak." The tension thickened, disbelieving murmurs spreading among the engineers. Sam Harris, the lead engineer with 2 decades of experience, stepped forward, his jaw tight. "Sir, this is a waste of time. He's a street kid, not a mechanic. We've got manuals and diagnostics and 6 hours behind us already." "You can't just—" "That's exactly the problem." Caldwell cut him off, his tone firm but measured. 6 hours of failure, 6 hours of the same eyes missing the same thing. Maybe fresh eyes see more. His words silenced the protest. Malik Johnson, though no one knew his name yet, stepped further into the hangar. He moved past the guards, past the engineers who glared at him with open contempt, and stopped in front of the gleaming machine. "You said it whistled during landing," he began, his voice steady, like a high-pitched note. "And afterward, it wouldn't spool up properly." The engineers exchanged glances, their surprise breaking through their irritation. Malik nodded, as if confirming it to himself. "That's no coincidence. That's your clue." Sam blinked. "How do you know that?" he muttered, half to himself. Malik didn't answer him directly. His eyes stayed on the machine. Caldwell, however, noticed. He leaned forward slightly, interest sparking in his cold blue eyes. He turned to his men. "Gloves." The order dropped into the room like a stone into water, sending ripples of shock and outrage across the team. "Sir, you can't be serious. He's not qualified. This is reckless." But Caldwell didn't move his gaze. "Give him the gloves." One mechanic hesitated, then reluctantly handed Malik a pair of gray gloves. Malik's hands shook as he pulled them on, but once they were fitted snugly, the tremor stopped. His shoulders squared, his breathing slowed, and for the first time he looked less like a homeless boy and more like someone about to do exactly what he was born to do. He stepped right up to the engine, placing his hand on the intake as though feeling for a pulse. The hangar seemed to hold its breath. Malik's fingers trailed along the smooth metal, his ear tilting slightly as if listening. He crouched by a panel near the compressor section and tapped it lightly. The sound echoed, faint but distinct. "Right here," he murmured, half to himself. The engineers sneered, but they leaned closer all the same. Malik reached for a flashlight from a nearby cart, his movements confident though unhurried. He peered inside, his eyes narrowing as he studied the clamps and wires hidden within. Behind him, one of the younger engineers whispered, "What's he even looking for?" Another scoffed, "He doesn't even know what he's touching." Malik ignored them. His hand traced a wire, then paused. "This clamp is on the wrong groove," he said finally, his voice clear. "It's tight, but it's leaking air. That's what caused the whistle." He touched the sensor wire gently. "And this insulation is cracked. It's rubbing against the bracket, feeding bad data into the system. That's why it won't spool right." The hangar erupted with disbelief. Sam's eyes widened. "How did we miss that?" Malik didn't look at him, because the two problems mask each other. If you fix one, the other still makes the engine fail. You have to fix both. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with realization. Caldwell stepped closer, his polished shoes clicking against the concrete floor. Malik stood a step back, his chest rising and falling in controlled rhythm, his eyes never leaving the gleaming machinery that had defined his moment. The billion-dollar man Richard Caldwell watching with the sharp gaze of someone who had seen countless men rise and fall, yet sensing something rare in this thin black boy who refused to flinch under doubt. The crowd of engineers shifting restlessly as if torn between anger at being outshone and awe at witnessing a truth they could no longer deny. The hum of generators mixing with the heavy silence of anticipation as Malik finally spoke. His tone calm, but filled with the authority of someone who knew engines the way a musician knows a melody, explaining how the clamp seated on the wrong groove created an air leak that mimicked more serious failure, the high-pitched whistle serving as the machine's way of crying for help, and how the cracked insulation on the sensor wire confused the control system by feeding it false data. The two faults tangled together so cleverly that no manual or surface inspection could reveal them unless the observer both listened and understood. His words flowing without hesitation as though he had rehearsed them 1,000 times in silence while staring through fences at planes he could never board, the engineers exchanging looks of disbelief because what he described was not just accurate, it was insightful in a way that cut to the core of the machine itself. Sam Harris, the lead engineer, finally muttering almost defensively that no reasonable technician would think to look for a clamp seated incorrectly since it still appeared tight. But Malik countered without arrogance, pointing out that a clamp too tight in the wrong place was often worse than a loose one because it deceived the eye while betraying the function. His logic so sharp it left no room for rebuttal, and Caldwell, still silent, tilted his head slightly as if cataloging every word, the billionaire's instinct whispering that what he was hearing was not luck or guessing, but genuine brilliance born out of knowledge and necessity. And when the engine roared to life for its test, the warning light flashed red. Panic erupted in the voices of the crew, but Malik raised his hand and said with calm certainty that it was not the core, it was the system recalibrating after being fed the truth for the first time in hours. And against the fear of the men who wanted to shut it down, Caldwell ordered steady hands, his trust placed entirely in Malik, the boy's voice anchoring the chaos with quiet authority until the red light flickered and finally turned green, the turbine smoothing into a flawless hum, the impossible achieved in less than 20 minutes. After 6 wasted hours, the engineers silenced not by commands, but by the sound of perfection, the engine reborn, and in that moment Malik's diagnosis was no longer a theory, it was proof, irrefutable and undeniable, a triumph that carried weight far heavier than the machine itself, for it shattered the assumption that knowledge belonged only to the polished, the certified, the formally employed, and Richard Caldwell's voice cut through the stunned air, asking the boy for his name, and when Malik answered, the recognition rippled across the room, one of the older engineers whispering that he had been the top student in aerospace engineering before vanishing without explanation, and suddenly the story of his homelessness gained shape, tragedy and resilience etched into the silence. And though Caldwell said little more, his mind already churned with possibilities, recognizing in Malik not just a savior of an engine, but perhaps the answer to something greater, the truth of how overlooked brilliance can still shine even in the darkest circumstances. The billionaire walking closer, his hand heavy on Malik's shoulder, his sharp gaze fixed on the young black boy, He asked without ceremony if Malik was ready for what came next, and Malik, though sweat beaded at his forehead and his stomach twisted in knots, nodded with the quiet certainty of someone who had faced greater fears than machinery, his voice steady as he said that the test would be dangerous but necessary to show the engine had truly been restored, his words landing in the room with the weight of inevitability. For there was no way to retreat now, not when so many doubting eyes demanded proof, and so the team rolled the engine into the testing bay, cables connected, fuel lines attached, safety cones positioned as beacons of caution, every man moving with practiced discipline but unable to shake the disbelief that they were preparing to follow the lead of a homeless black boy who had arrived in rags, and yet in the silence of their actions, a strange respect had begun to grow. Not spoken aloud, but undeniable in the way their eyes lingered on him, waiting for direction. The atmosphere charged like the pause before a storm, and when the red warning lights began to spin overhead, casting their glow across the white metal walls, the entire hangar seemed to hold its breath. Caldwell, unwilling to entrust the first spark to anyone else, stepped to the control panel himself, his hand resting firmly on the starter switch, his tailored suit a sharp contrast to the grease-streaked floor, his eyes never leaving Malik, who stood steady, his gloves hanging loosely at his side, his gaze locked on the turbine like a conductor ready to command an orchestra. And Caldwell, after a long pause that stretched like eternity, pressed the button. The engine leapt to life, a low whine building into a rising scream, the sound filling every corner of the cavernous space, numbers climbing on the monitors as the crew scrambled to record them, the vibrations rattling tools on nearby carts, and then, just as tension turned into relief, a shrill alarm pierced the air, a red indicator light flashing across the board, panic instantly seizing the engineers, shouts filling the hangar as Sam Harris barked orders to cut the power before damage was done, his voice urgent and heavy with fear. But before anyone could move, Malik raised his hand, his voice cutting through the chaos with the sharpness of conviction, telling them not to shut it down, insisting that it was not a failure of the core, but a recalibration of the system learning to process the corrected information, and though the engineers scoffed in disbelief, their eyes wide with terror at the thought of destroying the multi-million-dollar engine, Caldwell's instincts clashed with the years of experience around him, his jaw tightening as he scanned Malik's face, and in that brief instant he saw not panic but authority, the authority of someone who knew engines not just through books but through instinct. And he made his decision, his voice booming over the noise, ordering everyone to hold steady, and the room froze again under his command. The engine's roar wavered, the sound dipping and rising as though caught between life and death, the warning light blinking like a heartbeat on the verge of collapse, and Malik's eyes never wavered, his focus absolute, his hand still raised as he told them to listen. Listen to the rhythm of the turbine, listen to the smoothness hidden beneath the false alarm, and then, as the seconds stretched unbearably long, the light flickered once more before shifting from red to green, the alarm silenced, and the turbine surged into a flawless hum, stronger, smoother, more perfect than it had been in years, the sound of success ringing through the hangar louder than any applause could, the impossible achieved not just once, but twice, first in the diagnosis and now in the test, and the engineers who had mocked him stood slack-jawed, their disbelief collapsing into grudging awe, some even lowering their heads in shame. Sam Harris, who had doubted most loudly, staggered back, his voice barely above a whisper as he admitted that it was impossible they had missed such a simple yet devastating fault, and Malik, his chest rising and falling, explained without arrogance that the problems had hidden each other, a puzzle designed by failure itself, and only by listening carefully, by trusting the machine's language, could the truth be uncovered, his words carrying the calm certainty of someone who had lived his life, hearing voices no one else cared to listen to. Richard Caldwell, his eyes gleaming with a rare flicker of emotion, turned toward the boy, the noise of the engine fading into the background as he asked, almost in a whisper but loud enough for the hangar to carry, who Malik Johnson really was, and Malik, his voice breaking but his posture strong, gave his name, and the reaction rippled instantly through the engineers, whispers of recognition cutting through the air, one of them recalling that Malik had once been the top student at an aerospace program before vanishing without explanation, the truth spreading like fire across the team as disbelief shifted into revelation. The story of the homeless boy in rags transforming into something far more complex. A prodigy broken by tragedy, yet still carrying the brilliance that could save them all. Caldwell, hearing the murmurs but keeping his eyes on Malik. Richard Caldwell kept his hand on Malik's shoulder, his eyes sharp yet softened with something close to respect, his voice low but carrying the weight of authority as he asked the question that lingered in every mind. Who exactly was this boy? Where did he come from? And how did he learn to understand machines with such instinct? Malik, standing in the glow of the green light from the monitoring panel, swallowed hard, his throat dry, but his voice, though trembling slightly, did not falter when he spoke. My name is Malik Johnson, and the sound of that name fell into the room like a stone breaking water, ripples of recognition spreading through the group of engineers. Sam Harris was the first to react, his face paling as though he had been struck, his mouth parting in disbelief. Johnson, he breathed. From Georgia Institute of Aerospace, top of your class, the prodigy they used to call a genius. The murmurs began to spread, each whisper carrying more astonishment, for they had all heard stories years ago about a black student who had stunned professors with his mastery of engines, who was destined for greatness, who disappeared suddenly without explanation, and now that boy stood before them in torn clothes and worn shoes, repairing engines like a master, the irony cutting into their pride like a blade. Malik's eyes glistened, his jaw clenched, but he stood tall as he confirmed that yes, he had once been that student, yes, he had once been promised a bright future, and yes, he had vanished because life had torn him apart. The silence deepened as he began to speak not of triumph, but of loss, recounting how his father, a hard-working man who believed in education, had died suddenly from illness, leaving Malik and his mother to fend for themselves, how his mother, a white woman who had once been his anchor, had abandoned him after finding another relationship, leaving Malik crushed by betrayal, how grief had suffocated his ambition until the walls of classrooms and laboratories became unbearable, how he had walked away from interviews and opportunities, how he had thrown away his phone, cut ties with professors who pleaded with him to return, until the streets of Atlanta became his reality, hunger his companion, and invisibility his cloak. The room of engineers who had mocked him minutes earlier now stood with lowered heads, some ashamed of their laughter, some too stunned to even speak, the hum of the engine filling the silence like a witness to the truth. Caldwell's face, usually carved with the hard lines of business, softened in a way his team had never seen, his blue eyes holding Malik's dark gaze with something deeper than curiosity. It was recognition, not of status but of resilience. The billionaire who had spent his life surrounded by privilege and power, now standing before a boy who had been stripped of everything but still carried his gift intact. Caldwell finally spoke, his voice firm yet heavy with something personal. You didn't just fix my engine, you showed me what it means to endure. And his words carried across the hangar like a judgment that none dared to challenge. Sam Harris cleared his throat, shame evident in his expression, muttering that they had all been wrong to dismiss him, that talent did not wear a uniform or carry a certificate, it lived where it chose. Malik's chest rose and fell with the weight of the moment. His eyes burning with tears he refused to let fall, because this was not yet victory. It was only the unveiling of who he was, a boy once filled with promise, broken by tragedy, now standing in front of a world that had written him off, finally demanding to be seen. Caldwell, still with his hand firm on Malik's shoulder, looked at his team and told them to remember this day, to remember that greatness was not determined by appearances but by truth, skill, and heart, and his voice, sharpened by years of command, carried the authority of gospel. None dared to argue. Malik himself felt the weight of those words pressing into his chest. For years he had believed his name no longer mattered, that his brilliance had been swallowed by the streets. But now, standing there in that hangar, he realized that his name still had power. He wanted to know the truth behind the boy who had disappeared from promise into rags, his sharp voice cutting through the murmurs as he demanded Malik explain how someone who had once been top of his class, praised as a prodigy, now stood before them homeless, gaunt, and nearly forgotten. And Malik, who had carried this story like a chain for years, felt his chest tighten as every face in the hangar turned toward him, the same faces that had mocked him moments earlier now waiting in silence for confession. And though part of him wanted to keep his pain buried, another part knew that this was his moment not only to prove his knowledge, but to reveal the truth that had shaped him. So he drew in a deep breath, his voice trembling but unbroken as he began to speak, telling them about his father, a hard-working black man who had built his life on sweat and sacrifice, who had believed fiercely in education, who had told Malik from the time he could walk that his mind was his power and no one could take that away. But fate had not spared his father. Illness came swift and merciless, and within months he was gone, leaving Malik at 17 with nothing but grief and the fading echo of encouragement, his mother, a white woman who had once stood beside them, fractured under the weight of loss, and instead of holding her son tighter, she sought solace elsewhere, announcing one night with cold detachment that she was leaving to start over with another man. Malik's voice cracked as he recounted the moment he watched her pack a suitcase and walk out the door without looking back, and though her skin was pale and his was dark, he had thought love would bind them, but betrayal had taught him otherwise. The engineers around him shifted uncomfortably, their earlier arrogance now silenced by the boy's raw truth, and Caldwell himself, though hardened by years of ruthless business, felt his throat tighten because in Malik's voice he heard the weight of abandonment that no child should ever endure. Malik continued, his story unraveling in the hum of the hangar, explaining how he had tried to keep going, how he had held onto his place at the Georgia Institute of Aerospace, how professors had praised his brilliance, telling him he was destined for greatness. But grief is a slow poison, and the nights became unbearable, his dorm room suffocating him with memories of a father's absence and a mother's rejection, so he began to drift, skipping classes, avoiding friends, until one morning he simply stopped showing up altogether, disappearing not because he lacked skill, but because he lacked the will to fight, his voice heavy with shame as he admitted that he threw away his phone, cut ties with professors who pleaded with him to return, vanished from the future everyone had believed in, the streets of Atlanta becoming his new classroom, the cracked pavement and overpasses his shelter, hunger gnawing at him until he learned to survive on scraps, the world treating him like he was invisible, the years blending into each other until his dream felt like nothing more than a cruel memory, and yet, even as he wandered, one thing never left him, his obsession with engines. The way machines spoke to him in whispers others could not hear, the way he would stand outside fences at repair centers, staring through the chain links at mechanics working on planes, memorizing every sound, every motion, until he knew that knowledge had not abandoned him even if life had. The engineers in the hangar now hung on every word, some ashamed of their earlier laughter, others stunned that someone so gifted had been cast aside by forces beyond his control. Sam Harris lowered his eyes, guilt pressing on his chest, for he had mocked Malik without knowing the scars beneath his skin, and Caldwell, still silent, studied the boy as if he were reading a story written in pain and resilience, recognizing in Malik a reflection of something he had rarely admitted even to himself, that brilliance can come from brokenness, and resilience is forged in fire. Malik's voice grew steadier as he explained how that very morning, as he wandered past the hangar fence, that the world outside these walls needed to see what he could do, and that opportunity would come in New York where his company's executives were waiting for him, the billionaire's words carrying such certainty that no one dared object. And though Malik's chest tightened with fear, though doubt whispered that he was still a homeless boy in torn clothes, something stronger urged him to follow. And hours later he found himself seated nervously inside Caldwell's private jet, the hum of the engines he had revived carrying him across the skies, his reflection in the polished window showing not just a ragged boy but someone who had been called by destiny to step forward once more. And as dawn broke over the skyline of New York, Malik realized that he was about to walk into a different battlefield, not a hangar filled with tools but a boardroom filled with power and skepticism. The skyscraper that housed Caldwell's company loomed like a tower of judgment, glass walls reflecting the morning sun, the lobby bustling with suits and briefcases, and Malik felt smaller than ever as he followed Caldwell through the marble floors, their footsteps echoing toward the elevator, people turning their heads at the sight of a billionaire, accompanied by a boy whose clothes betrayed his hardship, whispers trailing them like shadows. But Caldwell never wavered, never slowed. And when the elevator opened to the top floor, Malik stepped into a space unlike anything he had ever seen, a boardroom with a ceiling so high it seemed to scrape the sky, walls lined with digital screens displaying aircraft schematics and glowing numbers, A long table of polished mahogany stretching like a battlefield where power was wielded through words and decisions, and at the far end sat a group of executives, all white, their expressions sharp enough to cut glass, their tailored suits speaking of privilege, their eyes narrowing in unison at the sight of Malik, skepticism dripping from every gaze. The man in the center, gray-haired with thin glasses, adjusted his tie and leaned forward, his voice calm but edged with condescension as he addressed Caldwell. "We've been waiting for hours, Mr. Caldwell, and I trust you have a very good reason for the delay." And Caldwell, unshaken, replied with measured authority, "I do. I bring you Malik Johnson, the engineer who repaired my jet engine in Atlanta after your so-called competitors failed." His words echoing across the polished room like a challenge, and the executives shifted, whispers erupting as their eyes swept Malik from head to toe. A woman in a crimson blazer raising a brow as she muttered that he looked untested, her voice dripping with disdain. "Is this a joke, Richard? You've brought us a street boy dressed in rags to prove what point exactly?" And Malik's heart hammered in his chest, his palms damp, his shame burning under their scrutiny. But before he could lower his head, Caldwell's voice sharpened, cutting through the derision. "Judge him not by what you see, but by what he can do." The gray-haired man leaned back, unimpressed, and said, "Very well. If you insist, let us test him." And with a few keystrokes, the screens on the wall flickered, schematics shifting into a virtual jet engine simulation, warning lights flashing red, numbers scrambling across the display. A digital failure designed to expose weakness? And the room fell into silence as every eye turned to Malik. Waiting to see if he would crumble under the pressure, Malik swallowed hard, the fear of invisibility gnawing at him. But then he remembered the hum of the Atlanta hangar, the trust in Caldwell's eyes, the way the engine had spoken to him when no one else would listen. And he stepped forward, his voice calm, though his heart raced. "This isn't the turbine or the fuel line. The vibration sensor is giving false high readings. Either the sensor is loose or the calibration offset is wrong. The vibration pattern doesn't match physical stress. It's software echo." His words flowed with certainty, his hands moving across the controls to isolate the problem, his eyes narrowing as he traced the data stream. And then with a few quick adjustments he resolved the error, the red light disappearing, the screen confirming calibration restored, and the silence that followed was heavier than stone. One of the executives, an older woman with silver hair pulled tightly into a bun, tilted her head, her eyes sharp with assessment, and after a long pause, she spoke with reluctant respect. "He's right. Perfectly right?" Her words carrying weight that silenced the whispers, and the gray-haired man with glasses shifted uncomfortably, his face paling as the realization set in that the boy had seen in minutes what trained analysts often struggled with for hours. Yet still he tried to diminish it, muttering that anyone could memorize a manual, his tone brittle. But Malik raised his hand slightly, asking quietly for another scenario, his voice calm but confident. And when the crimson blazer executive smirked and granted the request, typing quickly to generate a more complex failure, Malik faced the screen once more, scanning the chaotic numbers, his brow furrowing as he pieced the puzzle together. His voice steady as he explained that the bleed air valve was stuck partially open under load, starving the compressor of air, that the data pattern confirmed it, and if this were real, he would inspect the mounting first. But the solution was clear. The boardroom watched as the system confirmed his diagnosis, the error cleared, and silence gave way to stunned recognition. A leader, someone who could see solutions where others saw failure, his words slicing through the last remnants of doubt that clung to the air. Yet even as reluctant nods rippled around the table, one face remained hardened: Harrison, a senior executive whose career had been built on control, who saw in Malik not inspiration but threat, his jaw tight, his eyes narrowing with resentment. Though he stayed silent, his silence was louder than applause, and Malik, standing at Caldwell's side, felt the eyes of the board burn into him, half with disbelief, half with reluctant awe. But he did not shrink, his voice steady as he told them he had not come to take anything away from them. He had come to do what he was meant to do, to restore engines and restore faith in the possibility that skill can come from anywhere. And though he still wore the same torn clothes, though hunger still gnawed faintly at his stomach, in that room he was no longer invisible, he was undeniable. Caldwell's gaze swept the table, his voice booming with authority as he declared that Malik would not return to the streets, that his future would not be left to chance, that from this moment he would be given responsibility, the kind of responsibility that tested character as much as skill, and he announced in words that sent murmurs surging through the room that Malik Johnson would take over the Atlanta branch of Caldwell Aerospace Services, the largest operation in the southern region, a hub that had suffered from stagnation and poor leadership, a branch that needed the fire of someone who could not only fix engines but ignite people. The announcement stunned the room, jaws tightening, eyes widening, voices rising in protest, executives insisting it was reckless to hand such a massive responsibility to a boy with no official title, no degree, no polished resume, but Caldwell silenced them with one piercing glance, his voice colder now, as he told them that paper qualifications mean little when engines remain broken, that leadership is not proven by certificates, but by results, and Malik had given results that none of them could deny, his words pressing into their bones like truth they could not escape, and though Harrison's lips curled in disdain, even he could not summon an argument strong enough to dismiss what had just happened. Malik stood still, his chest tightening, his mind racing with disbelief, the reality of the offer nearly too heavy to grasp, and yet, as he looked into Caldwell's unwavering eyes, he realized that this was no trick, no gesture of pity, it was trust. Trust forged in the crucible of failure and redemption. And he bowed his head slightly, his voice breaking but strong enough to carry, saying that he would not run from it, he would not waste the chance. He would take the mantle laid before him, his words filling the room with a quiet power that silenced even the most resistant hearts. And as the decision became official, the atmosphere shifted, respect growing not from agreement but from inevitability, because whether they liked it or not, the boy they had mocked now carried the future of Atlanta's branch in his hands. As the meeting closed, Caldwell walked with Malik through the gleaming glass corridors, the billionaire's voice lower now but filled with rare warmth as he told Malik that leadership would not be easy, that envy would be louder than applause, that opposition would rise to challenge him at every step, but that he must remember engines do not run smooth without resistance, and in the same way a leader does not grow without challenge. Malik listened, his heart pounding, knowing that every word was truth, and though fear gnawed at him, he felt the spark of determination burn hotter, the same spark that had carried him into the hangar in Atlanta when he had nothing left to lose, and now with responsibility heavier than he had ever imagined. He understood that his life had shifted irreversibly, that the boy who once wandered streets begging for scraps now stood on the edge of commanding one of the most powerful branches in the industry. Yet as they stepped into the waiting elevator, Caldwell's phone buzzed sharply, his face darkening as he read the message that flashed across the screen, his lips tightening, his eyes narrowing with the weight of unseen threats. Malik noticed the change instantly, his voice low as he asked what was wrong. And Caldwell, after a pause, told him with honesty that not everyone would accept the decision, that there would be opposition in Atlanta waiting for him, people whose pride would not allow them to bow to a leader who broke their expectations, and Malik felt the warning like a cold wind across his skin, the realization dawning that while he had won a battle in New York, the war ahead in Atlanta would test him in ways far harsher than any simulation. But he straightened his back, his voice steady as he said he was ready to face whatever came, because he had already survived the worst life could throw at him. And Caldwell, seeing that fire in his eyes, gave a rare smile, a smile not of comfort but of respect, knowing that Malik was not simply inheriting a role, he was stepping into destiny. Hours later, as the private jet carried them back toward Atlanta, the flight back to Atlanta carried with it not only the hum of the powerful jet engines, but also the heavy silence of anticipation. Richard Caldwell working through his phone with rapid precision, Malik staring out the window as clouds drifted below like endless waves, the words of warning echoing in his mind that opposition would be waiting. And when the plane touched down and the convoy of cars carried them through the city streets to the gleaming Atlanta branch of Caldwell Aerospace Services, Malik's heart pounded with both fear and determination, for he knew that though the title had been handed to him in the boardroom, respect would have to be earned on the ground, among the very men and women who doubted him. And when the hangar doors opened, the sight that greeted him was one of practiced order, equipment polished, staff lined in rows, faces a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and outright resistance. At the front stood Adawale Harrison, The regional director, who had spent years commanding authority through seniority, his handshake stiff and his eyes cold as he greeted Caldwell and glanced briefly at Malik with a smirk that carried disdain, his voice calm but sharp as he announced to the assembled staff that their new leader had arrived, a boy pulled from the streets and given power, his tone dripping with sarcasm that stung Malik's ears. The murmurs spreading through the line of engineers and technicians as they sized him up, their eyes reading his torn clothes, his thin frame, their expressions betraying doubt that this young black boy could command their trust. Malik felt his stomach tighten, but he remembered the vow he made on the flight that he would not break, so he lifted his chin and met their eyes with calm defiance. His voice steady as he told them not to judge him by where he had been, but by what he could do. The words hanging in the air like a challenge that no one answered, but the silence was cut short when the first true test arrived. Barely a week into his leadership, before he had even learned the names of half the staff, an urgent call came in, a high-profile client reporting that their Gulfstream jet had suffered severe engine trouble just hours before an international flight. Panic rippling through the branch because failure would ruin their reputation before Malik had even settled into the office, and Harrison, arms folded, seized the opportunity to voice his doubt, his words dripping with venom as he announced to everyone present that it was time to see whether their so-called miracle boy was truly capable, his tone a dare more than a statement, and Malik, though fear twisted in his chest, did not back down, his voice firm as he ordered the aircraft to be brought into the hangar, the staff moving reluctantly, whispers buzzing like bees as they prepared for what many expected to be his humiliation. The Gulfstream rolled into the hangar, the nose gleaming under the fluorescent lights, its engine silent but radiating the weight of urgency, and Malik approached it with the same calm reverence he had shown in Atlanta's first hangar, his fingers brushing the metal as though he were listening to its heartbeat, his eyes scanning the details, his ears catching whispers of a machine struggling to breathe, the staff watching closely, some sneering, others curious. And after several minutes of silent inspection he spoke, his voice cutting through the air with clarity, declaring that this was not a fuel issue or a turbine failure, but a faulty bleed valve that stuck open under load, bleeding away the air the compressor needed, causing the stall, his explanation so confident that it silenced the room, and before anyone could protest, Sam Harris, who had flown in with Caldwell to support Malik, stepped forward and confirmed it, his tone carrying respect now, admitting that he had seen signs of the same issue, but Malik had recognized it instantly and explained it before anyone else could, the weight of his words causing heads to turn and murmurs of surprise to ripple through the staff. Harrison scowled, his pride wounded, but Malik paid him no attention, his focus entirely on the task, his voice firm as he directed the mechanics to follow his instructions step by step, teaching as he worked, explaining the logic behind every adjustment, his hands moving with precision, his confidence growing with every bolt tightened and every connection secured, the hours stretching into a blur of effort, sweat dripping down foreheads, tools clattering against the floor, until at last the repairs were complete, and the engine roared to life, its sound filling the hangar like thunder, smooth and powerful, no longer faltering, no longer broken, and the client, who had been pacing nervously nearby, let out a breath of relief before stepping forward to shake Malik's hand personally. The sound of applause in the hangar still echoed in Malik's ears as he stood at the center of the team he had just led through their first triumph under his command, the once skeptical mechanics and engineers now clapping him on the back, nodding in respect, and some even whispering apologies for doubting him. But Malik did not bask in the praise. He carried it with humility, his chest rising with the quiet knowledge that for the first time in years he had not only been seen but also accepted, and Richard Caldwell, who had been watching from the edge with arms folded, allowed the faintest smile to crease his face, a rare expression from a man known more for steel than warmth, but he knew that the boy had crossed the threshold. He had not only survived the trial, but had ignited belief, and as Malik walked into his new office for the first time, a space lined with windows that overlooked the runway, he felt a mixture of awe and disbelief. The desk, the chair, the nameplate, all symbols of responsibility, yet his heart told him this was not the end of a struggle, but the beginning of one even greater, because winning a team's respect in the heat of crisis was one thing, sustaining it through daily battles was another. Days turned into weeks, and Malik's leadership style began to shape the culture of the branch in ways that none of the seasoned managers had ever done. He did not simply order repairs or demand results. He walked the hangar floor, side by side with mechanics, asking questions, teaching them to listen to machines the way he had listened when everyone else dismissed him. He created training sessions where junior staff could shadow him, turning errors into lessons rather than punishments. And slowly but surely the walls of prejudice began to crack. Men who had laughed at his clothes now sought his advice. Women who had once doubted his authority now nodded with respect as they saw his consistency. And the murmurs that had once been filled with doubt shifted into stories of pride, the branch beginning to carry a new reputation, not just as the largest in the region but as the most efficient, the hum of engines repaired echoing like proof of transformation. Richard Caldwell visited often, sometimes unannounced, his sharp eyes assessing every detail, but each time he left with less to critique, his confidence in Malik deepening, his words to investors beginning to include the name of a boy he once met in rags, his voice carrying a pride he rarely showed, telling them that resilience could not be bought but could be discovered if one dared to look where others refused, and Malik carried that trust like armor. Though he knew enemies still lingered in the shadows, most notably Harrison, whose wounded pride festered like a hidden infection, his attempts to undermine subtle but relentless, spreading whispers of inexperience, planting seeds of doubt among higher executives, but Malik countered not with argument but with results. Every successful repair, every satisfied client, every improved efficiency a direct blow against the schemes of resentment. What surprised Malik most, however, was how his role began to shape not only the branch but also himself, because as he stood at the head of meetings, as he heard his own voice directing teams with confidence, as he saw eyes turning toward him, not with doubt but with expectation, he realized that leadership was no longer something he had to prove, it was something he had grown into. The boy who once whispered in hunger now speaking with authority, the boy once invisible now a man visible to all, and in that transformation, a quiet joy began to blossom, because it was not only engines he was repairing, it was lives. Men who had nearly quit their jobs reinvigorated by his passion. Young apprentices inspired to push harder because they saw in him the proof that talent could come from anywhere, his very presence dismantling the excuses of those who believed opportunity belonged only to the privileged. One evening, after a long day of inspections and paperwork, Malik found himself standing on the balcony of the office, the Atlanta skyline stretching before him, the hum of planes in the distance, the air thick with the promise of more to come. And beside him stood Caldwell, his voice softer than usual as he told Malik that he had reminded him of something he had long forgotten, that business was not only about profit but about purpose, and that seeing him rise had rekindled in his own heart a sense of belief. Malik listened, humbled, realizing that this relationship between them was no longer billionaire and boy, it was mentor and student, perhaps even father and son in spirit, a bond forged in respect and trust. Yet Malik did not let the comfort blind him to reality. He knew Harrison's silence was dangerous, his schemes likely growing more desperate with every victory, and though Malik's heart ached at the thought of more battles, he resolved that he would face them as he had always faced life, with resilience. The Atlanta branch thrived under Malik's leadership, its hangars once filled with skepticism now alive with a new spirit, the engines humming like testaments to progress, the staff who had doubted him working with renewed pride, and the clients spreading word that something extraordinary was happening in the South. Yet even as the numbers soared and respect solidified, Malik knew that his journey was not only about repairing machines or silencing doubt, it was about rewriting a narrative. His narrative. And as months turned into a year, he stood taller, no longer haunted by invisibility, no longer chained by abandonment, but empowered by purpose. His name now spoken with reverence where once it was whispered with pity, and Richard Caldwell, who had once seen in him only an intruder, now called him a partner, a man whose voice mattered in boardrooms where decisions shaped the future of aviation. And Malik carried that respect, not with arrogance, but with gratitude, always remembering that humility was the anchor that kept brilliance steady. The transformation was undeniable. The branch that had once been a symbol of stagnation now recognized as the most efficient, the most innovative, and Malik's leadership was credited not simply for repairs but for reshaping hearts, because he led not with titles but with example. his hands still willing to grease with oil, his ears still patient enough to listen to engines, his heart still sensitive to the struggles of those who worked under him, and the men and women who once laughed at him now stood proudly at his side, their prejudice replaced with loyalty, their doubt replaced with belief, their laughter replaced with admiration. And this was the legacy he valued most, that he had not only changed their opinion of him, but changed the way they measured worth altogether. But the greatest proof of acceptance came when Caldwell, in a meeting attended by executives from across the globe, introduced Malik not as a prodigy, not as a miracle story, but simply as a leader, equal among equals. His voice steady as he said that the future of his company rested on men like Malik Johnson, who understood engines because they understood life, who could endure storms and emerge stronger. And in that moment, Malik felt the weight of every hardship that had once threatened to break him transform into strength. Every night on the streets, every pang of hunger, every mocking laugh, every scar of abandonment, all of it had prepared him for this. All of it had shaped him into someone who could not be denied. And as he looked across the room of powerful men and women, he did not see barriers anymore. He saw doors that had once been locked but now swung open because he had refused to give up. Yet Malik never forgot those who walked where he once walked, never forgot the homeless boys staring through fences, never forgot the hungry eyes watching planes lift into skies they thought they would never touch. So he created programs within the branch to train underprivileged youth, to give them the opportunities he was once denied, to prove to the world that brilliance is not born only in privilege, but can rise from anywhere. And when the first group of trainees, many of them black boys who had been written off by society, completed their apprenticeships, Malik stood before them, his voice strong but filled with emotion, as he told them not to let anyone convince them that their color, their poverty, or their scars define them, that engines do not ask who you are before they break. They only ask if you can listen, and if you can listen to machines, you can listen to life. And if you can listen to life, you can repair it. His words searing into their hearts like fire, igniting belief where despair once lived. Harrison's resentment eventually burned itself out, his schemes collapsing under the weight of Malik's undeniable results, and he was quietly moved out of power, his bitterness swallowed by irrelevance. While Malik's influence grew beyond Atlanta, his name spreading across the industry as a symbol of resilience. And Caldwell, once a man hardened by business, softened in Malik's presence, often telling others that greatness was not in wealth or power, but in the courage to rise again when life tried to bury you. And Malik, hearing those words, always felt a pang of gratitude, not only to Caldwell but to the journey itself, because it had been in the fire of suffering that his strength was forged. Years later, Malik stood on a stage at a university, his face broadcast on screens across the nation, addressing an audience of students both black and white, rich and poor, his story now legend, and he told them of his fall and his rise, of how he was once a boy who thought his life was over, of how he walked into a hangar and asked only for permission to try, and how that moment changed everything. His voice steady as he delivered the message that had carried him from invisibility to destiny, that no tragedy is final, no prejudice unbreakable, no barrier unscalable. If you believe in your gift and refuse to quit, his words met with thunderous applause, tears streaming from eyes that saw themselves in his story, and as he stepped down from the podium, he realized that this was his true legacy, not just engines repaired but lives inspired. That night, back in Atlanta, Malik walked through the quiet hangar alone, the machine silent, the air filled with memory, and he placed his hand on the cool metal of an engine, the same way he had done the day he first interrupted, and he whispered softly to himself that he was no longer the boy who begged for scraps, no longer the student who vanished, no longer the outcast mocked for his rags. He was a man who had rebuilt his life, who had taken pain and turned it into power. And he smiled through tears because he knew that the journey had not only changed him, but had changed everyone who had witnessed it, and that was the greatest repair of all, the end. If this story has touched you, if you felt the weight of Malik's struggle and the strength of his rise, take a moment to support this channel by liking and subscribing. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories of resilience, justice, and hope. Tell us what you think about Malik's journey. Did the twists surprise you? Did his choices inspire you? And what part of the story struck you the hardest? We also want to know where you are watching from. Share your city or country in the comments so we can see how far this message travels. Every comment you leave adds to the community of voices that stand for dignity and second chances.